Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our COVID webinar, Top 5 Things You Need to Know About the New ISBE and IDPH Guidance. We've had so many new updates in terms of guidance, executive orders, emergency regulations. We know you guys are all working so hard to digest and implement all the new rules and recommendations, even as the school year is already underway. So we're hoping that we can provide a little bit of clarity and comfort today. I am Kendra Yoch. I'm excited to welcome you today. With me are three of our awesome Franczek team members who have been tracking these developments very closely. We have Nicki Bazer.
Hey, everyone.
Amy Dickerson.
Hi, everyone.
And Fattore Crumley.
Good afternoon.
Before we begin, please mark your calendars for our October equity webinar, which will be October 14th. As always, I do want to remind you to submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, because that's easier for us to track and hopefully be able to respond. And we will do our best to respond to your questions. If we don't get to your question, or if you have something else more specific, please do follow up with any one of our Franczek attorneys. Okay, so let's jump in. One of the most significant changes in the new guidance documents and new executive orders is to explain that schools have authority to exclude people in specified situations, and that that's different from quarantine or isolation. Dana, can you talk to us a little bit about what that change means?
Sure. I think if everyone remembers, I don't know if we all had this experience, but many school districts were getting pushback from parents like, I am not staying home. You do not have the authority to keep me at home. They would dispute the definition of close contact, just sort of attack it from all angles. And then we also had some state's attorneys' offices reaching out to us saying they were seeking evidence to institute these court orders against parents on behalf of the local departments of health. So the state's attorney in their capacity of representing these local departments of health. And what the governor's ordered is it basically gets us out of all that conflict. It basically says that school districts, you do have the authority to exclude cases, and then it sets forth these very specific rules or parameters for when you can exclude students. So an exclude means refusal to admit into school. It means extracurricular activities. It means any other event that you are sponsoring or organizing as a school.
Okay, so Nicki, what are those situations when students and staff should be excluded?
Yeah, absolutely, Kendra. And you said we were going to provide comfort on this webinar. I feel like you might have oversold things, clarity, hopefully. And this is one of those areas where I think it is really confusing. I was rereading all of the guidance documents again last night, and I was, again, having trouble. One good thing I should just note at the outset is that IDPH has reposted the exclusion tree, which I think a lot of districts were relying on. Then it sort of disappeared one day and we were all in a panic, and now it's back and it's updated, which is nice because I think it's super helpful. But on the exclusion, I want to sort of go high level here first. I think there's three main exclusion situations. So students and school personnel are subject to mandatory exclusions when they are a confirmed or probable case of COVID. They are a close contact under the definition we'll talk about later, or who exhibit COVID-19 symptoms. And so for those that are confirmed or a probable case, you have to be excluded for a minimum of 10 days if symptomatic following the onset of those symptoms, or the date of a test. So if you get a negative test, obviously, or if you get a positive test, then, again, 10 days for exclusion unless there's another direction from your local health authority. Close contacts must be excluded for a minimum of 14 days, again, or otherwise directed by the local health authorities. You can also, schools do have the option, we're going to talk a little bit about test to stay later, to allow asymptomatic close contacts to back on the school premises through test to stay. And there's obviously some restrictions on test to stay, and we'll talk through a little bit more on that. And then the final, with symptomatic individuals, you have to be excluded for 10 days or receive a negative COVID test. That was a little bit of a confusion on the first executive order. It was clarified So if someone has symptoms that otherwise would be symptoms of COVID, they have to be excluded. Or if they go and get that negative test and they're fever free and they haven't had diarrhea or vomiting for a certain period of time, then they can return. So again, sort of in summary, you know, obviously if someone is a confirmed or probable, they're a close contact, or they exhibit symptoms, that's when we're thinking about exclusion. The length of time is going to depend on the specific circumstance. And again, that decision tree, I think, is real helpful to rely on to sort of triage through this.
Great. Amy, can you talk us through a little bit just the definitions of probable and confirmed cases? Because I think it's helpful that those are actually pretty clearly defined now.
Yeah, for sure. So when we're talking about, you know, a confirmed case, we're talking about somebody with a, you know, a positive PCR test, and that's our confirmed case. When we're talking about a probable case, under the executive order and the guidance, you come to be probable if you have a positive antigen test, regardless of whether you have symptoms or not, or if you are symptomatic and have had exposure to a confirmed or probable case, even if there has been no test. And what we really see is that the confirmed and probable cases are treated the same in terms of what the implications are of that, so that once once you are probable, then you have to be excluded in the same way that you would have to be if you are confirmed. And then the requirements for returning would be those that Nicki just went through. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that I think, especially while we've had the terminology for probable of a probable case, you know, in past guidance, we're now seeing that really clearly defined and having to then follow that in accordance with that definition.
Okay, so symptomatic cases, I feel like there is still some complicated pieces to this, some nuances. Nicki, can you walk us through how we think through that?
Give it a go. So obviously, you know, take a look at the decision tree, because the symptoms are slightly different that they're listing in terms of what is a symptom of COVID. And obviously, you know, you want to pay close attention to that. But you do have to be excluded if you are symptomatic and until you have a negative COVID test, or you remain out for 10 days. So if you get a COVID test and it's negative, then someone should remain out of the school until they've been fever-free for 24 hours without, you know, fever reducing medication. So they're no longer exhibiting fever 48 hours after diarrhea and vomiting have ceased and the symptoms have improved. So in that case, obviously, you know, the student doesn't have COVID, but if they're still sick, they stay home per our normal sick procedures. If testing is not performed, so the student decides not to get a test, or the parent does, then the child must remain out for 10 days. And again, until they're fever-free and there's no diarrhea and vomiting. So I guess the one of the key things to note under the decision tree is that a negative antigen test is now permissible, along with a PCR or a negative rapid PCR. We're all getting so good at figuring out all this very complicated testing, but an antigen test is now permissible. You can use that unless there is a specific scenario in play that makes the antigen test not allowable. And that's, you know, if it's someone's a close contact to a confirmed case. So you would know someone has COVID, they're a close contact, you're experiencing an outbreak, and outbreak is defined within the guidance, and we can talk about that. Or because of your community transmissions, the health department is requiring that higher level of testing. So again, lots of nuance, as you said, Kendra, and really working your way through that tree and making sure you understand the parameters.
I do think it's worth noting, though, that this is a pretty big change, because we did have school districts under that guidance that was issued previously. The PCR test really was sort of held up as you must have this type of test. And now that they've allowed in certain circumstances to have the antigen test, I think that is positive, because those do tend to come back quicker. You know, there's the rapid test kits now that gives parents a little bit more flexibility to send the kids back to school with fewer days out. And I think that helps the school district as well.
Yeah, and I see we've got a related question. If somebody has symptoms and they don't have a negative test, but they have an alternative diagnosis, if you have a note from the doctor that says, oh, it's allergies or it's, you know, some other thing, is that sufficient for the student to be able to return?
I'll take a stab at that. I think that depends on, again, there's a part of the decision tree, are the symptoms new to the person? So, I mean, allergies I would put in a different bucket, and I'd like Nicki and Amy's thoughts on this. Then all of a sudden you wake up with something in the morning that you're not sure if you've caught a bug or not. So they do not, I think that situation, if you know a student has allergies, but you would just send the student to school if you really knew it was allergies. But the alternative diagnosis on something that is new or newly experienced is no longer permitted. So you can't say, you know, the student has strep throat, or the student has a cold, or the student has this with a doctor's note and not do the testing.
That's right, Dana. So there's all these, there's so many footnotes to this document that it kind of drives you a little bananas, but there is a footnote that's very clear that if the symptoms are attributed to a pre-existing condition, you have an asthma action plan for the student. The doctor is saying that this is asthma related. Likely you don't need the antigen or a test then, but as you're saying, Dana, if it's something else that's not a pre-existing condition, it's not underlying allergies, strep is a great example, you also need that COVID test. And, you know, we're seeing some back and forth in the chat, and I think that's right. They no longer allow this alternative diagnosis, again, unless there's some specific pre-existing condition. And it's interesting because we're getting some comments in the chat about the fact that Cook County has said that antigens are not being allowed during periods of high transmission. So, you know, we are also struggling with the difference between the local health departments and what they are putting out versus what IDPH is putting out. So, you know, I know that is a struggle out there. I will say in this circumstance, there is something within the guidance itself that talks about that if the local health department may require something higher because of the community transmission levels. And so in that particular case, I would follow what Cook County Public Health is saying. I know that it's frustrating because getting a PCR test can be more complicated, but they are reacting to transmission rates and presumably if the transmission rates go down, that guidance from the local health department will change as well.
Right. So PCR test in that situation based on what the local health department is declaring as the conditions.
And I will say, you know, to Nicki's point earlier about the decision tree now being updated and out and helpful, while there are many footnotes, this particular sort of nuance or exception to the negative antigen test is right there in the chart. And so that and what the three sort of scenarios would be when a PCR test may be required for somebody symptomatic is there in that new decision tree chart.
Okay, Amy, so what about you have one household member who has symptoms and is, you know, going to be out at least until those symptoms clear, until they get that negative test. What about their siblings or other household members? How do we think about those people?
Yes, when we're talking about sort of that scenario that Nicki was just going through, for household members who are vaccinated, it appears that they don't need to be, you know, excluded. And then what we now see as well is that for unvaccinated household members of somebody who again is just that symptomatic and maybe waiting for that negative test or those test results, those unvaccinated household members only need to be excluded if the symptomatic person is not tested within 24 hours of, you know, having been first notified or experiencing the symptoms. So if that test is done within the first 24 hours of that symptom onset, then the guidance says that the unvaccinated, you know, household members can be in school. And, specifically for an individual with, it says for, an individual with COVID-19 symptoms, but without a high suspicion that the ill person has COVID-19. So either that high suspicion might be prompted by if they are close contact or have some sort of loss of taste or smell, then household members may remain at school with consistent use of well-fitting masks, so long as, again, then that symptomatic person is tested within 24 hours of symptoms. And of course, if they test positive or aren't tested within the 24 hours, then household members must be excluded from school. So there are some nuances there, but this also, I think, is a change that does allow household members, even those unvaccinated, to come back, while someone otherwise is out waiting for pending test results, so long as those circumstances exist.
Okay, that's helpful. So let's talk more about close contacts who are not household members. How long do they need to be out? What does that exclusion look like?
Yeah.
You want to jump on that too?
Yeah. So I know, Nicki went through these earlier, but the new requirements under the executive order and guidance is that schools must exclude close contacts for a minimum of 14 days or as otherwise directed by the school's local health authority, which could recommend options such as exclusion for 10 days or 7 days with a negative test result on day 6. And a test to stay option, as Nicki talked about, and we'll talk about it more specifically, that may also be available for certain situations where close contacts are and remain asymptomatic and were masked during the entire exposure period. So for example, if they weren't exposed during lunch, where masks would be off. And so the guidance goes through, again, there's some flow charts now, in addition to the decision tree, as to, what those requirements are. And the guidance really talks about, the schools have to follow that unless they're otherwise directed by the local health department.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about testing and the distinction here between the antigen tests and the PCR tests. We've run into a couple of situations where you have somebody who has an initial positive test when they take an antigen test, but then get a follow-up PCR test that's negative. Does that mean that they are in the clear? Nicki, how do we work through that?
Right. So if someone is symptomatic and they receive a positive antigen test, it doesn't require any confirmatory test, like that you are treating that person as a case of COVID. And even if they get a negative PCR test after, they still are considered to be a probable or confirmed case and need to be excluded. So the positive antigen test stands for someone who's symptomatic, and a later negative PCR test is not going to, in essence, discount or be deemed that person was a false positive. I think the interesting question that this opens is what happens if you are asymptomatic and you receive a positive antigen test and then a subsequent negative PCR test. That is unanswered in this guidance. We actually have posed that question to IDPH and to the governor's office, and we are waiting to hear back, because that could also occur within the school building if you're testing your athletes or whatnot. So we will certainly get back to everybody when we find out the answer to that.
Okay. So one of the other things that's new in this guidance is something really just directing schools that schools have a responsibility to conduct contact tracing. Dana, do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So if you know of a situation where you have, especially since there's so much screening going on now in schools, and I know the SHIELD test is up and running in some places and not in others. But if you are identifying positive cases and you're having close contacts, it's now the school's obligation to determine whether or not other contacts in schools must be excluded, not the local Department of Health. And actually, I think you had a very large role in that, because obviously you hold the information as far as who's sitting by who's having lunch with whom, who's on the bus, and all of that. And you also need to institute a tracking process to monitor the individuals excluded from school because they have symptoms or because they're diagnosed or have been exposed. So sort of categorizing those people who are close contacts and why they're staying out, and distinguishing between the actual positive cases and the people that are just being held out because they are suspected probable cases or close contacts. We've got a lot of questions in the chat. So I know we usually tell people to put questions in the Q&A because it keeps it easier for us to keep track of. But Kendra, should we take some of those?
Yeah, let's look at this. So confirmation here, students who have a negative test result can stay at school as long as they don't have a fever or diarrhea and are not a close contact. Or is it the case that all students who are symptomatic need to stay at home for 24 hours even with a negative test? So students with a negative test result and no symptoms can stay at school, or is there a waiting period?
I thought he said a negative test result and symptoms. Like, so I guess that I think the question is sort of about people that are I mean, can we just say for a minute, like, people shouldn't go to school with diarrhea? Just as a former teacher, let's just put that out there. But I think what the question is if you have a negative test but you're symptomatic, does every symptom need to resolve, or is it just those symptoms that need to resolve? Is that might be the way I'm
right. So I think, yeah, and then the guidance speaks specifically to those symptoms, but schools have always had the authority, if you have symptoms of some other contagious malady, to exclude that as well.
Correct.
Yeah. So the answer to the actual question asked is that no, the student does not need to stay home for 24 hours, even with a negative test. They have to have a negative test. And if they have the specific symptoms of fever or diarrhea, then they have to wait out those periods. They have to be 24 hours fever free and 48 hours from diarrhea and vomiting, for the reasons that Dana so lovely articulated. So there's not an extra 24-hour period if the symptoms have resolved and they are now negative. So yeah, that answers that.
I think that does. Yes.
Thank you, Nicki, for putting the decision tree in the chat. So if people are looking for that, it's right there. We do have a question about bus contacts that I think we're going to get to in a minute. Another question, at-home test kits seem to be more common recently, but the guidelines say they should not be accepted as negative test results. What weight, if any, should we give them? What do you do if a family comes in with a negative at-home test? Does that factor into how we treat that student?
I mean, I think I'll, say the first point is to emphasize that that's right in terms of, when we're talking about a symptomatic, somebody who's symptomatic and we have to exclude them until they have that negative test, like we've been talking about. The guidance and particularly our new exclusion tree makes clear that home test kits are not allowed. So while we talked about that a negative antigen result is now permitted, unless there's one of those, exceptions to that, that would not include a home test kit.
And I think it's important to let parents know that in the guidance that you are putting out, so that they're not going to, those tests are not prohibitively expensive, but they're not cheap. And I think parents should be aware that they need to go and get a test from a testing facility before spending the money on that. So, yeah, always look for ways to reduce people getting angry with you.
Right.
And another part of the question was sort of, so what value should we give them? I don't know that the rest of the guidance that we've seen thus far, talks about how those could be used in the school setting in other ways. Of course, from a personal use, those could be, people can use them for a variety of reasons in terms of deciding, how they're going to be participating in certain things based upon the results of those. But from the school setting, I think that it's that those can't be used in terms of allowing somebody to come back in.
Okay, and then we have another question asking if the IDPH guidance has been updated so that family members don't have to be excluded from school if the symptomatic person is tested within 48 hours rather than 24. Nicki, can you clarify on that for us?
Yeah, it definitely says 24. So this is the situation where someone is sent home sick with suspected COVID symptoms, and must their siblings then be sent home or kept home as well? And what the FAQ says, number 46, is that if the ill household member is tested within 24 hours, then the household members do not need to isolate, unless, of course, that household member ultimately tests positive, and then they'll be isolated as close contacts.
Okay, so let's think about some examples of close contacts. So we have a few examples. One addresses one of our questions. Let's say Susie and Janie sit next to each other on the bus every day. Susie has a positive COVID test. How do we determine, is Janie going to be a close contact based on sitting next to Susie on the bus? Dana, can you help us?
Sure. So this was one of the questions in the chat. I think, you have your habits. Maybe the bus drivers have their habits before they start the ignition and take off every morning. Maybe the habit should be to let all those windows down halfway. That was my habit when I would have smelly junior high boys on the bus. I'm like, before we get on, we're going to put all the windows at halfway. So if you have the windows open, or if you have a HEPA filter on the bus and the students are masked on the bus, Susie and Janie sitting next to each other on the bus is not going to create a situation where Janie is a close contact. So that, I think, does provide you with some relief. But again, you have to have the distancing, and sometimes the distancing of the 3 feet is not possible on the bus, right? So these are all very case-by-case scenarios. Actually, the distancing do not require exclusion. I said that wrong. You do not have to exclude on the bus based on the 3 to 6 feet if you have the HEPA filter, the open window, and the masking. So that's the bus situation. Okay, different situations, and the problem is you have to keep track of where Janie and Susie are every place and where Janie is every place. So the next question was, what about lunch? Lunch, if they have their masks off and they're eating and it's longer than the exposure period, which is 15 minutes, they're going to be close contacts and you're going to need to institute a quarantine.
Unless they are vaccinated, right?
Unless they're vaccinated. We were assuming Susie and Janie are little girls in our story, but if they're big girls and they've had their vaccine, then they are excused from quarantine.
Okay, so walk us through in general. We do have this sort of exception now for students in the classroom and this 3 to 6 feet distance. Dana, can you explain that part?
No, Kendra, I can't, because I missed the whole part of your first conversation. So someone else.
I got it.
Yeah.
So
okay.
You're asking about what are the definitions of close contacts?
Yeah, who's a close contact, and we know there's the exception now in the classroom. How does that all fit together?
Yeah, well, let's talk about who's not a close contact, because I think that's really helpful, because we do have the new school definition, right? So students within 3 to 6 feet of a confirmed or probable COVID case in the classroom, if both parties were consistently masked, which we know that they should be given the mandates, during the entire exposure period, those students will not be considered close contacts and do not need to be excluded from school. Individuals, again, who have been are fully vaccinated will not be considered a close contact, even if they are within that exposure period. Or individuals who tested positive for COVID in the last 90 days and both of those groups fully vaccinated or tested positive, and they're asymptomatic. Obviously, if someone's symptomatic, they get excluded for that reason. If the exposure is outdoors, then those are not considered close contacts. And again, what Dana just eloquently went through on the bus. So, if someone, if you are on the bus and you have all of the precautions in place that Dana mentioned. So again, I can repeat that because it looks like someone in the chat needed me to repeat it, which is that if kids are within 3 to 6 feet in a school building, in a classroom, I should say, and both students are masked and consistently through the entire exposure period, if one of those kids tests positive, the other kid does not have to quarantine or be excluded from school. individuals who are fully vaccinated or individuals who tested positive for COVID within the last 90 days and are asymptomatic. So both those groups asymptomatic, if they are otherwise in contact with someone who is COVID positive, they do not need to be excluded. And again, outdoor and then the bus.
And regardless, the second situation you gave was regardless of masking.
Correct. But again,
because they're
our
all
students should be wearing masks at school.
Absolutely. Except for at lunch. I think
right.
Lunch is the problematic period.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lunch
absolutely.
is the period you need to pay most attention to.
Definitely.
And a clarification about the bus, you need a HEPA filter or the windows down, right?
Right. You don't need both.
Okay. Does the distance matter on the bus?
Again, the distance does not matter on the bus.
Okay. All right.
HEPA filter, windows. I confused everybody. My apologies.
All right. So one of those two. Great. Okay. So let's transition to this test to stay. Amy, can you talk to us a little bit more about how that process works?
So we've have this process out there, that can be utilized in certain circumstances. So I'll go through what we know about it, and I will note, and I cringe at having to say this because I feel like we say this often, but we noted that in the latest ISBE IDPH guidance that references the test to stay process, there is a note that's sort of a placeholder that acknowledges that there will be an updated link with updated guidance on the test to stay process. Our hope is just because I don't know how much more we can all take with changing things, even though we know that might happen and we'll all be okay. But hopefully the test to stay guidance that is going to be forthcoming may just be a reiteration of what we've already seen in previous guidance, and I'm expecting it just to maybe be a standalone document that's talking about the test to stay protocol. So just as a warning there. But so with that said, what we do know about what has been explained by ISBE and IDPH in terms of the test to stay process is this. So it may be used for indoor exposures, except when it's a household exposure, for students and staff that are not fully vaccinated, where both a COVID-19 case and the close contact were engaged in consistent mask use for the entire exposure period. So when we're talking about close contacts and when our close contacts need to be excluded from school, a test to stay option, the test to stay option could be put in place if those parameters are there, that if both the COVID positive case and close contact were engaged in consistent mask use for that entire exposure period. If that's the case, then the test to stay process would allow them to remain in school so long as they're tested on days 1, 3, 5, and 7 from the date of exposure with a NAAT test, such as a PCR test, or a rapid antigen test with emergency use authorization. If the close contact tests negative, then they may remain in the classroom. The testing has to be conducted in school, and if the identified dates fall on a weekend or holiday, then the guidance that we've seen states the testing should be conducted at the earliest possible opportunity. So individuals engaging, again, in the test to stay process, they do have to maintain physical distancing, 3 to 6 feet in the class, or, and 6 feet during lunch, and masking for 14 days. So I think the key things to note with the test to stay process is that if they're unmasked during exposure, such as during that lunch period that we were just talking about, then the test to stay would not be an option. Guidance does talk about certain circumstances where a local health department might recommend it not be used, and so that also needs to be considered and factored in as well.
Thank you. Okay, let's go back to buses because I know that is confusing, and I think we confused it more. So I'm not following through on my promise.
I think it all turns. I think we really have to clarify is how you have the kids situated on the bus. If you have kids sitting right next to each other in the same seat, there could be a situation where you're going to have to identify someone as a close contact and quarantine. It's really this, I think it's easier stated if you state it as If the kids are a minimum 3 feet apart, right? So you have kids every other seat and separated by the aisle, and you've got the windows open, and you have, or you have a HEPA filter, then you do not have to quarantine. But if you have kids that are closer than 3 feet and they sit next to each other, regardless of the HEPA filter in the window, then you are going to have to quarantine on the bus. So it really is how you're staffing those buses. And I think I can see why that's a panic point and a pain point, because we also know about the bus driver shortages. So just to be crystal clear, 3 feet is really the thing to remember.
Okay, thank you. Let's transition to our other big topic where we're getting lots of questions, and that is the vaccination and testing requirements for staff. Nicki, walk us through the basics on that.
Sure, I'm happy to go through and we'll talk about some of the nuances here or the problems that are coming up. I think everybody is probably fully aware of what the requirement is at this point, but all school personnel must be fully vaccinated. They were supposed to have their first shot or the one shot by the 19th, and then within 30 days, if they're getting the multi-shot vaccine, within 30 days of that first shot, or they need to submit to weekly testing. So you are either vaccinated or you're testing. I will say that those are the minimum requirements as set out in the executive order. Obviously, with for the vaccine requirement, exemptions for folks who are religiously or medically exempt, but then they must test. Unvaccinated folks need to be in the process of getting vaccinated or they need to be testing. I said that those are the minimum because the executive order did allow for more stringent requirements, and there are some school districts we know that have required that, you have to have one of those religious or medical exemptions, or you can't continue to test indefinitely. They are requiring vaccine. One of the strange nuances that we're still seeking clarity on, just to flag, is that per the FAQ and the ISBE guidance, unvaccinated staff who have a documented COVID-19 infection in the last 90 days are exempt from the weekly testing requirement due to, I guess, the fact that the antigens remain in your system, or although I play a medical doctor on TV here, I am not one or a public health official, but you could get a lot of false positives. The exception, though, is not in the executive order, which really governs school districts. So we have asked the governor's office what is going on with that, because we've gotten that question and we will keep you posted on that. If you have a staff member in that situation, feel free to reach out. We can talk through it. So again, if you have a staff member who is not fully vaccinated or not testing, then you need to exclude them, refuse admittance to them, and make sure they're not in your school buildings.
Okay, so let's think through some of the ways this gets complicated. If you have an employee who says no to vaccine based on a religious reason, but then also says, I'm not going to test either, also based on, a religious or, conscious reason. How do we think about that?
So, I mean, this is a real issue, and we're seeing this in a lot of school districts, of enough numbers that I know it's causing a lot of concern. So it is very clear in the executive order that people could receive a religious exemption to the vaccine requirement. And, there's a process to go through, as you all know, for, seeking submission of information on that and determining if someone does have a sincerely held religious belief. If there is not a corresponding exemption in the executive orders for refusal to test. And so, we have been advising that, you certainly can provide accommodations to people with religious objections to testing by way of which tests they use. So if you are offering Shield in your school district and they prefer to use a Binax test and they want to do that at Walgreens and provide you with that negative test, that's an accommodation that you can offer, but you're not going to just simply allow them to refuse testing. That's not allowable under the executive order, and certainly would be under Title VII standards an undue burden on a school district when you are both trying to comply with the executive order and also trying to keep your school safe. And someone who's unvaccinated in your school building, needs to at minimum be tested. So
Okay.
the next go ahead.
I mean, I just think that you explained that very well. I think the undue burden aspect of Title VII is really important in that whole religious exemption to testing. I think you can use that undue burden analysis to, again, accommodate, but not permit the person to say, I am not going to test at all.
Right,
exactly. But then you have to go through that, the act that everyone knows. What did the act that everyone used to be is the Illinois Healthcare Right of Conscience Act. So Nicki, why don't you start us off on that?
This heretofore very, very never sort of brought up case. I mean, I think there are maybe 5 or 6 cases even under this cases that have actually been litigated under this act, has now obviously come to the fore. And the argument is that the way that this law is written, that it allows someone to assert their sort of conscience on an issue, which is defined in the act as sort of a belief in God or a belief system that comes from like a God-like entity. So it's sort of religious in nature. I will say, just to step back, if you actually look at the history of this law, it was very clearly intended to essentially allow healthcare professionals in a healthcare setting to refuse to perform certain medical procedures that they themselves objected to on religious grounds. And so the obvious one is that it really arose out of doctors and nurses saying, I don't want to participate in the performance of an abortion. And this law allowed them to do so without facing repercussions from their employer. I think we can safely say that it was never intended to allow to be applied in this situation. I think the position we have taken is that it doesn't apply, that it's not a basis to refuse testing. I know some districts have also gone down the road of looking beyond just what someone has submitted and actually asking questions about this belief, because most of us, and Dana was just regaling us with the post-50 testing regime of Americans. You know, we've got colonoscopies, we've got mammograms, we've got all sorts of tests, strep tests, things that people do all the time, and sort of really probing behind that and saying, when did this belief take place that you can't test, and really pushing on that. So there's some different ways to go about pushing back on this. We know that this is going to end up in the courts. We may see some legislation. I'm happy to help navigate if you've got some employees who are putting forth these objections.
Okay, so another challenge districts are facing is generally, not having enough people to start with, aides, bus drivers, anybody. And then with this, vaccine requirement on top of it, if we're excluding more people, Dana, what kind of options do districts have if they're just short on staff?
Well, I mean, I think that is a huge challenge. I mean, I think that's something that you need to be working on all the time. There's really no exemptions to these executive orders. I think we have to be working with staff. And, Nicki said, when people are raising these objections, working through, have you ever had a strep test, working through those avenues. But also, I think hopefully we have relationships with different people in our staff, and we can talk to them just in a very down-to-earth, realistic way. I really don't think they even understand sometimes what they're doing. And if you have those relationships, you might be able to get people to comply. I do think it was interesting. I saw on NPR yesterday that where they have instituted vaccine requirements, most people have made a lot of noise about they don't want to do it, but then most people have complied. So I would exercise some patience there. I think some of the other issues that we're seeing is looking to work with unions on like starting salaries, because there's a labor shortage every place, and seeing if your starting salaries are allowing you to really make sure you're getting bus drivers, aides, looking at, third-party organizations like different businesses you can contract with to get staff in on a temporary basis. Sort of looking to your people that were recently retired. you know, who can come back and maybe fill in part-time. That's a group of very, you know, experienced, knowledgeable people that could really provide a great public service, not only get paid extra, but really are providing a public service. So that's what we're recommending. I know that's not, there's not a real good quick fix to that.
Yeah, definitely a challenge. Another nuance that is, I'm glad to hear there are still kids doing internships. So what if you've got a high school student who's interning maybe as part of a school class, but it's at a place that requires vaccination, like they're interning at the local elementary school? Does that high school student then have to get vaccinated?
I think the answer is yes, right? The high school student is going to be an intern at a place that requires vaccination. They need to get vaccinated in order to be in that setting. I don't know that they need to be vaccinated to receive their services though, right? So if it's part of a transition service, you might need to look at accommodating that in another way, changing the class, providing them with another opportunity to have a similar experience. But I don't think, I think that students do need to understand, and this is sort of a teaching moment, that there's certain requirements for certain jobs. Everyone obviously missed that lesson, and that's why we're in the situation we're in. But there are certain things you have to do for certain jobs, right? You have to like wear your hair back if you're going to work with food service. So if you want to wear your hair down every day, not the job for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what they need to do with if this is a high school, they need to be working with the entity, because obviously some are requiring vaccine, some are allowing for testing. So, you know, if it's an elementary school, I would say defer to the elementary school and how they're enforcing. If the elementary school said, or the entity says, we're fine with whatever the high school is imposing, then again, following what you're following for the folks that are in your school building. So again, vaccine or testing is an alternative. Or if the kid just doesn't want to do it, as Dana said, maybe that's not the internship for them, and maybe they just need to wait on it a bit and do it post-COVID, hopefully.
Right. So Nicki, we've all been hearing about in the news and following the various litigation that's going on across the state, specifically challenging the governor's orders. Can you give us a little bit of an update on where things stand?
Yeah, I mean, I think my update is really that the cases are all over the place, right? So, and we're seeing them in counties, you know, all over Illinois, and we're seeing very different results. You know, some of the cases are challenging masks. You know, a lot of those cases they've sought temporary restraining orders for mask imposing. A lot of those have been denied. Some of them have been granted on a temporary basis. We've seen some who are also, you know, the challenging exclusions or quarantines. Dana sort of touched on this. A lot of those cases really stem from that 48 hours requirement. And so now that we have that exclusion law, we have a little bit of a different flavor. We definitely have some testing and vaccine cases, again, set for hearing. Some of them haven't been even heard yet. And so, you know, we have a case right now talking about, you know, the Healthcare Right of Conscience Act that they're trying to get the Supreme Court. Having read the cases, the request for review by the Supreme Court, it's a little bit baffling what they're trying to do, but I do think we're going to continue to see some of these things bubbling up. Not a lot of cases yet in our, we should say, immediate area for a lot of the folks probably on this call. We're seeing some. I know there is one case in DuPage. I haven't seen any registering yet in Cook or Lake. There's one in Will. So again, smattering all over the place, all at different points. But I think we're likely to see some of these cases either bubble up, or we're likely to see some legislative changes, maybe even as early as veto session.
Okay, so let's switch over a little bit and talk about all these kids who need to be excluded because they fall in one of these categories. What are the requirements related to remote instruction? And I guess, you know, Dana, some of the nuances here, you know, for a student maybe who has symptoms, who could come back with a negative test, but whose parents don't get them tested, and so they're going to be out for 10 days. Does that change, you know, the responsibility with respect to remote learning?
So remote learning is causing a lot of consternation and when it's required, because I think they've kept the very sort of stringent requirement of the synchronous and the asynchronous instruction and the time limit requirement. And so basically the kids that are on quarantine, because they have to be on quarantine because of the rules we've all just covered, do require remote instruction. But we did have that one little small bright spot, which is letting that antigen test be the entry back into school under some circumstances, which is a quick test. And what do you do with the parents that are like your employees refusing to test their children, saying, I don't want my children to, and do we then have to give them the same remote instruction that's required for the other kids on quarantine because they have a path back? And I know there's pushback from teachers. Teachers do not like I'm going to have 10 people on Zoom and 10 people in the classroom, or it's very distracting for them. It interferes with the lessons that they're trying to do with the kids that are in school. But I think that that's probably a situation where they are going to be entitled to some remote instruction. I think that you can make what Nicki and I discussed this earlier, though, what's the risk? If you did just provide them with packets and they stayed out the whole day and they later said we should have had, some synchronous time on Zoom, would 10 days of synchronous time on Zoom really be enough to base a claim on? And wouldn't you be able to sort of use as your defense is that you could have gone to get this test and you could have come back right away. So I think districts are going to have to use some judgment there. Nicki, did you want to?
No, I mean, I think what you're navigating through, which is challenging, is that obviously what ISBE has said, right, is that you have to have the 5 hours of instruction. But then there's this language about striving to provide synchronous learning. Now, some districts have decided, we've strived, we've strove, we've striven, we're done, right? Like we can provide electronic resources, we can provide packets, we're not going to do it. Others have decided to provide more robust synchronous instruction when a student is excluded from the classroom. And so as we try to navigate through, I think the questions arise, well, are all the exclusions sort of created equal, right? So if a kid has, first of all, if a kid has COVID, and Dana, you point this out all the time, which I think is a really strong point to remind us, is that if a kid has COVID and they're actually sick, they may not be able to engage in the sort of robust remote instruction, just like if they have the flu, they are likely not going to be engaged. Right. But assuming that they are, if they are excluded because they're a close contact or they have COVID, but they are not highly symptomatic, you may want to provide that synchronous instruction. Whereas if you guys are, if a district is implementing a travel, exclusion, or like you're saying, Dana, where there's an option to test and they've turned it down, maybe a district is saying, look, those students really, they have a choice. They've had a choice in the matter, in essence, or the parents did more likely. We're going to provide them with remote instruction, but we're not going to do that synchronous learning. It may, for some districts, it may be more trouble than it's worth to try to differentiate these kinds of students. Others, it may be important. Again, could you be challenged on this? Probably. Is it going to result in you having to revamp your program? Probably not. I do think that part of what we're struggling with still is that this guidance, and I was just looking at the date on this, from ISBE came out, I think, on August 31st, which on remote instruction, and I know many of you had started well before that. So I think that this is, we're still navigating through this. And I think, hopefully the COVID numbers are all going down, but if they start to go up again or there's a new variant, I think sort of the levels of remote instruction and the number of kids quarantined, or if schools have to go on adaptive pauses, I think the guidance is likely to continue to adjust and adapt.
Another variation on the remote question is if you have a student, who maybe has a medical condition and they're able to be at school, but maybe their doctor has written a note saying, but if there's any case of COVID in the class, regardless of how far away this student was, because of this increased risk, they need to isolate or, be excluded from school because of this, heightened risk in their medical condition. I'm going to, impose a higher level of, carefulness than what's actually required by the law. Would those kids get remote, do we start thinking about home hospital? Dana, can you think through that with us?
I think that we really need to be careful about distinguishing between who gets remote and who gets home hospital. And not that home hospital is, I mean, it's not certainly 5 hours a day. It's 5 to 10 hours a week. So even if you are, doing work that's 5 hours and you're not following the recommendation for, the synchronous instruction or the live instruction, and the home hospital is going to require some contact, but it's a lot less contact. So I really think it is important to distinguish between those two groups of kids. The kids that the quarantine is the quarantine. You're not going to be in the quarantine just because one doctor says your quarantine is different than everyone else's rules for quarantine. Those apply to everyone. If a student has a health condition that makes them more susceptible and they need accommodations, then that's going to be home hospital. And remember, you don't have to be special ed to get home hospital. It could be for a temporary medical condition. It could be for, quasi-temporary medical condition, not a really short medical condition, but it could be for like an orthopedic condition. It could be for a illness that would not be covered under IDEA, but under 504. And that's when you look to that programming to fill those gaps, not just you get remote instruction. But I think some of this is there are people that still want remote instruction, no matter what. And I think there are specific reasons why, we've decided as, if you look at from the U.S. Department of Education down, specific reasons why we're trying to discourage that. That being said, we still have to be mindful of our obligations under Section 504 and other disability statutes to accommodate those types of students.
Okay. I want to hit a couple questions quickly that we got ahead of time. Amy, does all of this new guidance apply to private schools, parochial schools, therapeutic day schools? What's the application here?
Yeah, from a general standpoint, yes, it does. We talked about a lot of different pieces of guidance, and most of them do apply to all schools, including our private schools. I'll say that when we talk about the remote guidance instruction, while it's titled as applying to all schools, if you actually look at the language, especially when we get into what the remote instruction has to look like, the language is all referencing school districts' obligations and is directed toward school districts, at least in the language. So when it comes to what that remote instruction has to look like for individuals that are being excluded, private schools may have some flexibility there, but that's a may, because we still have your requirements, especially for most of our private schools who are recognized, to make sure that they're complying with requirements in terms of instructional hours and things like that. So, I'd work with counsel to assess your particular flexibility there when it comes to the particular situation your school might be in. But otherwise, generally, yes, it applies to all schools.
Okay. The guidance does talk about the documentation that you need to collect from staff who are, their vaccination status or their testing. Do they have to submit that to anybody to prove that they're in compliance?
We don't see any language, especially in the emergency rules is where they especially talk about what those record keeping requirements are. And no, we don't see a requirement, excuse me, that those need to be submitted anywhere, but there is a clear requirement that schools do have to maintain proof of vaccination and testing. So there is that obligation there that needs to be paid attention to.
Okay, and Nicki, we had one question come in about this remote. Does it count the sort of window into the classroom, students at home zooming into the existing class? Is that synchronous? Does that count as synchronous?
So one thing I would just remind everybody is that there's no absolute requirement related to synchronous. So whether or not it sort of qualifies as synchronous, I think, it's an interesting question, but I don't think it's required in terms of compliance with the remote learning guidance. But I would certainly argue that it is synchronous, and I know a lot of schools are sort of titling it like broadcasting rather than synchronous, so that the teachers feel like kids can listen in, but they're not obligated to sort of interact with those students. But again, there's no specific requirement for synchronous. So, but I would say that would count.
Okay, so we're at 1 o'clock. Thank you everybody for tuning in and for all of your questions. Again, if you have additional questions, please do reach out, and we wish everybody well. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.